This week on Diplomatic Channel, the conversation over Nigeria's democracy continues with our interview with former External Affairs Minister Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. June 20th is World Refugee Day, with this year's theme, Take a Step, focused on families. We speak to the UNHCR representative to Nigeria and ECOWAS, Mr. Antonio Jose Kandula, and the head of sub-office Maiduguri of same organization, Mr. Alexander Kishara, on this year's theme and Nigeria's IDP problem. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. I am Amarachi Ubani. Let's begin with a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says it is unmistakable that Iran is responsible for the attacks on 2 tankers last week and that the United States does not want to go to war with the country. During an interview on Fox News, Mr. Pompeo praised President Donald Trump for doing everything he can to avoid war, but added that Washington will guarantee free navigation through vital shipping areas. U.S.-Iran tensions have been high following accusations by the Trump administration that Tehran carried out attacks last Thursday on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, a vital oil shipping route. Iran has denied having any role.
President Trump has done everything he can to avoid war. We don't want war. We've done what we can to deter this. The Iranians should understand very clearly that we will continue to take actions that deter Iran from engaging this kind of behavior. I made a number of calls to my colleagues around the world yesterday. I am confident we will have partners that understand this threat.
Meanwhile, Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates, Mr. Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, says a state sponsor was involved in the May attack on oil tankers in the Gulf, but did not name any particular country. He also did not mention the attacks that took place on 2 other tankers on Thursday, June 13th, in the same area. Mr. Nahyan told reporters after his meeting with his Cypriot counterpart that his country has not named a specific state, but that the attack could have been made possible by a state sponsor.
Thank you for your strong support for the UAE's position on the attacks in our seas, which we've presented our evidence to the UN, to the Security Council. We've done that in a very technical manner. We've done it in a manner which is responsible, open, transparent, and we've invited many of our friends and allies and partners to look at it. Our conclusion is this has only been possible by a state-sponsored attacks.
UK Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister hopeful Jeremy Hunt says Britain is almost certain that Iran was behind attacks on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman last week, adding that London did not believe anyone else could have done it.
Well, we have done our own intelligence assessment, and the phrase we used is almost certain. We've got videos of what happened, we've seen evidence, we don't believe anyone else could have done this.
Sudan's former president Omar al-Bashir has been charged with corruption-related offences, appearing in public for the first time since he was overthrown in April. Wearing traditional white robes and turban, he was driven to the prosecutor's office in Khartoum. Looking much the same as prior to his ouster, he walked briskly from the vehicle into the building, smiling and speaking with the guards escorting him. Minutes later, he walked out after prosecutors read out the charges he faces. Mr. Bashir was given a chance to respond to the charges against him, but his lawyers declined to answer reporters' questions. Finally, Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, has apologized after she indefinitely delayed the extradition bill which sparked one of the most violent protests in the city in decades. Her apology came as hundreds of thousands of black-clad protesters maintained calls for her to resign over her handling of the bill that would have allowed people to be sent to mainland China for trial.
I feel deep sorrow and regret that the deficiencies in our work and various other factors have stirred up substantial controversies and dispute in society, following the relatively calm periods of the past 2 years, disappointing many people. We will adopt the most sincere and humble attitude to accept criticisms and make improvements so that we can continue to connect with the people of Hong Kong.
Protesters formed a sea of black along roads, walkways and train stations across Hong Kong's financial centre to vent their frustration and anger at the bill and the government's handling of the resulting demonstrations. Saturday's dramatic suspension of the bill was one of the most significant political retreats by the Hong Kong government since Britain returned the territory to China in 1997, and it threw into question Ms. Lam's ability to continue to lead the city. Welcome back. On Saturday, June 15th, the European Union Election Observation Mission Nigeria released its final report on the country's general elections conducted in February this year. In the summary, the EU chief observer, Ms. Maria Arena, said systemic failings seen in the elections and the relatively low levels of voter participation show the need for fundamental electoral reform. A reform, she says, needs political leadership that is dedicated to the rights of Nigerian citizens and an inclusive process of national dialogue involving state institutions, parties, civil societies and the media, and reforms that need to be urgently undertaken to allow time for debate, legislative changes and implementation well in advance of the next elections. This assessment is quite similar to ones expressed by other observers who feel more needs to be done to improve our electoral system. If we're going to be inviting international observers, we need to listen to what they have to say about our elections. But as we observed before the general elections, observation and interference are a fine line. Remember, the Nigerian government had to send a warning to the international community not to interfere in Nigeria's domestic affairs. Some have argued if you say they're your friends and they've been there in times of need, they have earned the right to a chair when the family meets over issues. In the concluding part of my interview with Nigeria's former External Affairs Minister, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, I asked him what he thought of the international community's interventions in Nigeria's issues and even her political system, and what needs to change to achieve growth in our democratic system. Would you say the international community has helped in shaping Nigeria's democracy? And I ask this because, every time we hold elections, they monitor the elections, and then they, pass judgment. They sort of validate our elections. I know there was a time in this recent elections, they got into a small, spar with the Nigerian government, which accused them of interfering, in our democracy. Do you think they interfere more than they assist?
Well, let me put it this way. The international community has never been happy at our electoral process and the results. I remember, and if you remember, the electoral mission, the monitoring mission by the United States, led by Carter, absolutely refused to sign on to the report, the one that elected General Obasanjo. Carter refused to sign that. The process and the result are totally unacceptable to them. And we've always had this. At times, grudgingly, they feel, oh, well, it's come close, which I find insulting, really. It's like, well, given Nigerian standards, what do you expect? They've had the elections, there are no riots, no violence, let it go. But I don't believe that we've ever had any free and fair elections in this country. We need to be fair and frank about saying that, so we will know the issues to address. Don't forget, I was a member of the Electoral Reform Commission, headed by Justice Owais, set up by Alhaji Yaradua, who himself said to us, I don't believe my election was free and fair. He said it to us when he set us up. And we spent time looking at areas where we could make the electoral reform better. And we submitted this report to President Yaradua. He accepted the report, but then later on the big guns in the PDP came to him and said, you can't accept this report. If you do, you have blocked the areas we use in rigging the election and getting ourselves into power. Unfortunately, President Yar'Adua was, by that time, the state of his health was such that he really couldn't effectually push back against these big barons of PDP. And so, like you said earlier on about the report of the autopsy, the report was shelved and thrown into the cooler. Now, the same PDP has been a victim of the issues we raised that they should have addressed at that time. But out of ego, they thought they would be in power for 50 years, and they didn't address it. So really, our elections have always left a lot to be desired. Inflation of figures, underage voting, violence driven that, frightens voters away, hijacking the ballot box. Every time we have elections, we have this and we never address them.
It sounds like I should ask again if Nigeria is a fully democratic country.
Well, let us be charitable and say we are on the path. Very slowly. From time to time, there are exits that we take, and we hope we will reconnect with the democratic express route, ahead. But let's give the devil his due. The National Assembly from time to time comes up with the Electoral Reform Act amendment, and so they bring up issues, in terms of electronic voting, in terms of judicial intervention in the election of governors, going all the way to the Supreme Court rather than stopping at the Court of Appeal. They come up piecemeal amendments that will make the electoral reform process better, rather than to take the Uwais report and really wholesale address it. Let me give you one example. The Uwais report said, in a situation where there is violence and you detect who is responsible for that violence, because the violence could actually be by your opponent, that man will be disqualified for 5 years or 10 years, I don't remember, from participating in any electoral process. That was to deter, one party instigating violence against. Number two, we said where the courts find out that candidate X stole an election, that candidate X should be deterred for 10 years from participating in the electoral process. Again, to deter people from saying, either way, I am going to. Number three, that where the court find out that candidate X lost the election and yet lost the election fairly, and yet he's come to the tribunal, he should pay all the expenses of the man who actually won and is declared the winner by the court, so that you stop, frivolous petitions and so on. All these are in the Uwais report, but as I said, they were never taken. So there's a long way to go towards our reaching, the promised land in terms of free and fair elections.
Professor Akinyemi, thank you so much for speaking with us.
My pleasure.